Welcome to the Heart's Haven. Let the story begin. Translate this first. Poor girl said. The millionaire was stunned. Translate this, and maybe you'll earn what's left. The words landed cold in the winter air, sharp, effortless, practiced. Daniel Carter didn't even look down when he said them. His eyes were still fixed on the glass doors of his headquarters, 40 stories of steel and silence rising behind him like a monument to control. People usually reacted one of two ways. They walked away, or they apologized. But this time, something didn't follow the script. Then you should read mine first. The voice was small, calm, not pleading, not afraid. It didn't belong in this moment. Daniel paused. Not fully just enough for the rhythm of his stride to break. A fraction of a second. The kind most people wouldn't notice. But for a man who measured his life in precision, it was enough to feel wrong. He turned, slowly. She couldn't have been more than 8, sitting on a flattened cardboard box near the edge of the building, wrapped in a faded grey hoodie that had seen too many seasons. In her lap rested a worn notebook, its edges curled, pages thick from use. A pencil was tucked behind her ear like it belonged there. She wasn't looking at the ground. She was looking at him. Not with desperation, not with hope, with certainty. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen thousands of faces in his life, investors, rivals, reporters, but something about this one didn't fit into any category he understood. "You heard me," he said, voice even, controlled. "If you want something, you prove your value first." The girl tilted her head, just a little. "And you?" she asked softly. "Do you?" Silence. The city moved around them, cars rushing past, heels clicking against pavement, the distant hum of conversations, but between the two of them, everything narrowed into something still. She reached into her notebook and carefully tore out a single page. The sound of paper ripping was quiet, but it carried. "Translate this first," she said, holding it out. No hesitation, no trembling hand. Just an offer. Or maybe a challenge. Daniel looked at the page, then at her again. For the first time that morning, he wasn't thinking about numbers, or meetings, or outcomes. He was thinking about why an 8-year-old girl wasn't asking for help, but asking to be understood. And somewhere deep beneath the layers, he had spent years building something shifted. Not broken, not yet, but moved. Daniel did not take the paper right away. For a man who signed contracts worth millions without a second thought, this felt different, slower, heavier, as if the weight was not in the page itself, but in the moment wrapped around it. The wind slipped between the buildings, carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee from the corner cafe. Somewhere behind him, the revolving doors opened and closed, executives stepping in and out, their voices clipped, their pace urgent. That was his world. Fast, predictable, controlled. And yet, he was still standing here, looking at a child with a notebook. "You think this is a game?" he asked, his tone quieter now, but still edged with authority. The girl shook her head. "No," she said simply. "I think you forgot something." Daniel frowned. That was not the answer he expected. He finally reached out and took the page. The paper was rough beneath his fingers, slightly creased, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. There were 2 columns of writing, neat and careful, one in English, the other in Spanish. Small drawings filled the margins, stars, hearts, a tiny house with smoke rising from the chimney. He scanned the first few lines. It was a story. Not impressive in length, not complicated in structure, but there was something about the way the sentences moved, simple, honest, unguarded. A girl who sat behind a library after school. A girl who listened to people talk, but was never spoken to. A girl who believed that if she could just find the right words, someone would finally hear her. Daniel's eyes slowed. Without realizing it, he read the same sentence twice. Across from him, Sophie watched quietly, her hands now resting in her lap, as if she had already done her part. "You wrote this?" he asked. She nodded. "I translated it too," she added, "so more people could understand." Daniel let out a faint breath through his nose. "That is not how the world works," he said. "People do not listen just because you translate something for them." Sophie studied him for a moment, then tilted her head again, the same small gesture from before. "No," she said gently. "They listen when it matters." The words landed differently this time. Not sharp, not challenging, just true. Daniel looked back down at the page. There, near the bottom, written in slightly darker pencil, was a single line, underlined twice. "You built machines that help people talk to each other. But who helps them feel less alone?" His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. The noise of the city seemed to fade, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. For years, Daniel had built something extraordinary. Systems that translated languages in seconds, software that connected continents, deals that reshaped industries. He had always believed that was enough. More than enough. But standing here, holding a page written by an 8-year-old girl, he realized something he had never allowed himself to consider. He had taught machines how to speak, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how to listen. Daniel did not realize how long he had been standing there. The page was still in his hand, but his attention had drifted somewhere deeper, somewhere unfamiliar. The kind of place he usually avoided by filling his days with numbers, meetings, and decisions that never required him to feel anything at all. A car horn sounded down the street. Someone laughed. A bus pulled up to the curb with a long sigh of air brakes. Life continued. But for Daniel, something had slowed. He looked up at Sophie again, really looked this time. Not as an interruption, not as a distraction, as a person. "You said you translated it," he said, his voice lower now, less guarded. "Where did you learn?" Sophie gave a small shrug, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of her notebook. "Library," she said. "They let me stay if I am quiet." Daniel glanced at the notebook again, then back at her. "And this story, is it real?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked past him, toward the tall glass building that carried his name in polished steel letters. Her reflection flickered faintly in the surface, small and almost invisible against the towering structure. "Does it have to be?" she asked softly. The question settled between them, heavier than anything she had said before. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was used to having answers. That was what people expected from him. That was what built his reputation. But this was not a negotiation. It was not a problem to solve. It was something else entirely. Behind him, his phone buzzed sharply in his coat pocket. Once, then again, then again. He did not need to check it to know what it was. Board members waiting, assistants asking, schedules tightening. The world he controlled was calling him back. For a brief moment, his hand moved slightly toward his pocket, then stopped. Sophie watched him, not impatient, not demanding, just waiting, as if she already understood the decision he had not yet made. "You should not be out here," Daniel said finally, though the words felt weaker than he intended. "It is cold. You should be somewhere safe." Sophie smiled, but it was not the kind of smile children usually gave. It was small, knowing. "I am okay," she said. "I have my words." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest at that. Not pain, not exactly, but something close. He looked down at the page again, at the careful handwriting, the small drawings in the corners, at the line that refused to leave his mind. Who helps them feel less alone? For years, he had built systems that translated voices across continents in less than a second. And yet, standing here, he realized something unsettling. This girl, with nothing but a pencil and a worn notebook, had just said more to him in a few sentences than most people had in years. "You said you wanted me to translate this," he said slowly. Sophie nodded. Daniel took a breath, steady but unfamiliar. "Then tell me," he said, his voice quieter now, almost careful. "What do you think it means?" Sophie looked at him, her eyes clear, unshaken. "It means," she said, "you can understand the words, but still miss the person." The city noise returned all at once, louder, sharper. But inside Daniel Carter's world, something had already shifted. Not loudly, not completely, but enough that, for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer certain he understood everything. Daniel Carter had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation. He had built systems that could process thousands of languages in seconds. But now, standing on a cold New York sidewalk, holding a single sheet of paper written by a child, he found himself choosing his next words more carefully than ever before. "I understand the words," he said slowly. "That is not difficult." Sophie did not respond. She simply watched him, as if waiting for the part that actually mattered. Daniel exhaled lightly and looked down at the page again. The sentences were simple. Anyone with basic training could translate them. That was never the challenge. The challenge was something else. Something he had spent years avoiding. He crouched down. The movement felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a role he had long outgrown. His tailored coat folded slightly at the knees, the fabric brushing against the pavement. For the first time in a long time, he was no longer looking down at someone. He was looking across, at her level. "You said I forgot something," he said. "What exactly did I forget?" Sophie did not answer right away. She reached for her notebook again, flipping through the worn pages with care, stopping at one filled with smaller handwriting. Notes, corrections, words circled and rewritten. She turned it toward him. "These are all the words I did not know," she said. "So I looked them up." Daniel studied the page. Every unknown word had been rewritten beside it, sometimes 2 or 3 times, as if she had practiced until it felt right. "You worked for this," he said. Sophie nodded. "Because I wanted people to understand," she replied. Daniel's eyes lifted slightly. "And did they?" A small pause. Then a quiet answer. "Some did," she said. "Most were too busy." The words were not bitter. That was what made them heavier. Daniel felt a subtle shift inside him again, like something loosening that had been tightly held for years. His phone buzzed once more in his pocket, longer this time, insistent. He ignored it. For the first time, ignoring it did not feel like losing control. It felt like gaining something else. "Tell me something," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its usual sharp edges. "If people do not listen, why keep writing?" Sophie looked down at her notebook, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the page. "Because someone might," she said. Daniel swallowed slightly. The answer was simple, but it carried a kind of quiet strength he could not argue with. For years, he had built everything around certainty, data, predictability, outcomes he could measure and control. But this was built on something far less certain. Hope. He glanced back at the sheet in his hand, then at Sophie again. "Translate this first," she had said. He finally understood. She had never been asking him to translate the language. She had been asking him to translate the meaning, to see what was beneath the words, to see her. Daniel folded the page carefully, more carefully than he handled most documents worth far more money. Then he looked at her, not as a CEO, not as a decision-maker, but simply as a man standing in front of a child who had quietly rewritten the rules of the moment. "All right," he said. His voice was steady, but something inside it had changed. "I think I am starting to understand." Daniel remained crouched there, the folded page resting lightly in his hand as if it had become something fragile. Not because of the paper itself, but because of what it now carried. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about efficiency or scale or outcomes. He was thinking about a single question that refused to let go. Who helps them feel less alone? He looked at Sophie again. "You said some people understood," he said. "The ones who did, what was different about them?" Sophie did not answer right away. She shifted slightly on the cardboard, pulling her hoodie closer around her shoulders, more out of habit than discomfort. "They stopped," she said finally. Daniel frowned faintly. "Stopped?" She nodded. "They stopped what they were doing. They looked at me, not just the paper." Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "They listened like I mattered." The words settled into him with a quiet weight. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Daniel felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, something he could not categorize or reduce into logic. It was not guilt, it was not regret. It was recognition. He thought about the hundreds of conversations he had every week, meetings filled with voices, presentations filled with words, negotiations built on language so precise it left no room for error. And yet, how often had he actually listened? Not to respond, not to decide, but to understand. The answer came quickly, almost never. His grip on the paper tightened slightly, then relaxed. Across from him, Sophie had already returned her attention to her notebook, flipping it open again as if the moment had passed for her, as if she had said everything she needed to say. Daniel watched her for a second longer. Then something shifted again. A decision. Not loud, not announced, but real. He reached into his coat pocket, not for his phone this time, but for something else. A pen, sleek, expensive, usually used to sign documents that changed entire companies. Today, it hovered over a child's page. "What are you doing?" Sophie asked, glancing up. Daniel hesitated for just a second. Then he answered honestly. "I am translating," he said. "Not the words. The meaning." He wrote slowly, deliberately beneath her final line, not correcting, not improving, just responding. When he finished, he turned the page slightly toward her. Sophie leaned in, her eyes scanning the new sentence. For a moment, she said nothing. Then something small changed in her expression. Not surprise, not excitement, something softer. As if, for the first time, someone had answered her in the same language she had been speaking all along. Sophie read the sentence twice. Her finger traced the words slowly, as if she wanted to be sure they would not disappear. Daniel did not interrupt. He simply watched. For a man who had spent most of his life filling silence, this moment felt unfamiliar, but he did not rush to break it. "What does it say?" he asked gently. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes softer now, but still clear. "It says," she began, pausing slightly, "I did not know I stopped listening until someone spoke in a way I could not ignore." Daniel felt the words settle into him, not as a statement, but as a truth he had quietly been avoiding for years. He nodded once. "That sounds about right," he said. Sophie closed her notebook halfway, still holding the page between her fingers. "You understood," she said. It was not a question. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air. "I am trying to," he replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued around them, but the distance between noise and meaning felt clearer now. Daniel shifted slightly, still crouched, still at her level. "What happens to your stories?" he asked. "After you write them?" Sophie glanced down at her notebook. "I keep them," she said. "Sometimes I read them again. Sometimes I change them." "Why change them?" She thought for a second. "Because maybe the ending can be better," she said. Daniel's expression changed, just slightly. That idea, it stayed with him. For years, he had believed outcomes were final. Decisions made, deals closed, paths set. But hearing her say that, maybe not everything had to stay the way it was. Maybe some endings could be rewritten. His phone buzzed again, longer this time, more urgent. Daniel finally reached into his pocket and pulled it out. The screen lit up with missed calls, messages stacking one after another. His name, his company, his world, all waiting. He looked at it. Then, without hesitation, he turned the screen off. Not out of defiance, out of clarity. When he looked back at Sophie, his voice was different now. Not softer, not weaker, just present. "Do you have somewhere to go today?" he asked. Sophie gave a small shrug. "Library opens at 10, she said. Daniel checked his watch instinctively. It was just past 9:15. 45 minutes. He stood up slowly, then extended his hand, not to lead, not to control, just to offer. "How about we do something different until then?" he said. Sophie looked at his hand, then at him. "What kind of different?" she asked. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. "The kind where someone listens," he said. For a brief second, the world felt lighter. Not because anything around them had changed, but because something inside him finally had. Daniel's hand remained extended for a moment longer than expected. Not because Sophie hesitated, but because something else did. Inside him, a familiar voice, quiet but persistent. "This is not your responsibility. You have meetings, deadlines, people waiting." The world he had built did not leave space for moments like this. It moved forward, always forward, measured in profit margins and quarterly growth. And for years, he had followed that rhythm without question. Sophie looked at his hand, then back at his face. She was not impatient. She was simply waiting, not for permission, for truth. Daniel slowly lowered his hand, not withdrawing the offer, but grounding himself in the decision behind it. "You do not have to come," he said. "I just thought, maybe we could talk somewhere warmer." Sophie studied him for a second, as if measuring something deeper than his words. "You are busy," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. Daniel let out a small breath. "I am," he admitted. The honesty surprised even him. Sophie nodded slightly, then looked down at her notebook again. "Most people are," she said. The sentence was simple, but it carried the weight of something she had learned too early. Daniel felt that same quiet pressure in his chest again, the one that did not push him away, but pulled him closer. Behind him, the glass doors opened once more. "Mr. Carter." The voice was sharp, urgent. His assistant, Emily, stepped out onto the sidewalk, tablet in hand, her expression tight with concern. "We have been trying to reach you," she said quickly. "The board call starts in 10 minutes. They are already asking where you are." Daniel turned slightly, the familiar world snapping back into place. Schedules, expectations, control. Emily followed his gaze, then paused when she noticed Sophie. Just a brief flicker of confusion. Then professionalism returned. "We really need to go," she added, lowering her voice. For a moment, everything balanced on a thin line. The life he had built, and the moment standing right in front of him. Daniel looked at Emily, then at the building behind her, then back at Sophie. Sophie did not say anything. She did not ask him to stay. She did not ask him to choose. She simply held her notebook as if she already understood how this would go. And that was what made it harder. Daniel reached into his coat pocket again, pulling out his phone. The screen lit up instantly, notifications flooding in. He stared at it. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pressed the side button. The screen went dark. "Reschedule it," he said. Emily blinked. "Sir?" "The call," Daniel repeated. "Calm, steady, move it." There was a brief silence. They will not like that," she said carefully. Daniel nodded. "I know," he replied. Then he turned back to Sophie. And this time, there was no hesitation. "Come on," he said gently. "We have 45 minutes." Sophie looked at him, then at the building, then back at him again. And for the first time, she reached out her hand, not because she needed help, but because she believed him. The cafe was warm, not just in temperature, but in a way Daniel had almost forgotten how to recognize. The soft hum of quiet conversations, the clink of ceramic cups, the low rhythm of music playing somewhere behind the counter. It was the kind of place people stayed in, not rushed through. Sophie sat across from him, her notebook placed carefully on the table, a cup of hot chocolate resting between her hands. Steam curled upward, fogging the edge of her vision for a moment before disappearing. Daniel had ordered coffee. He had not touched it. For once, he was not here for the coffee. "So," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice calm, present. "Tell me another one." Sophie looked up. "Another what?" "Your stories," he replied. "The ones you think people are too busy to hear." There was no pressure in his tone, just curiosity. Real curiosity. Sophie studied him for a moment, as if making sure this was not temporary, not something that would disappear the second he checked his phone again. Then, slowly, she opened her notebook. "This one is not finished," she said. "That is okay," Daniel answered. She nodded, then began. "It is about a man," she said, "who built something very big." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, but he did not interrupt. "He thought it helped everyone," she continued. "And maybe it did, but he never stopped to see the people who were still standing outside." Her voice was soft, steady, not accusing, just telling the truth as she saw it. Daniel listened, not preparing a response, not analyzing, just listening. And then one day, Sophie said, turning a page, someone asked him a question he could not answer. She paused, looked at him. "And that is where I stopped writing." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes resting on the notebook, then lifting to meet hers. "Maybe it does not stop there," he said quietly. Sophie tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out the folded page again, smoothing it gently against the table. "Maybe," he said, "that is where it changes." Sophie looked at the page, then at him. "And how does it end?" she asked. Daniel paused. For a moment, the old version of him might have tried to answer perfectly. But now, he chose something different. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. Then, after a brief second, he added, "But I think we can write it." The cafe door chimed softly as someone entered, letting in a brief gust of cold air before it closed again. But at their table, time felt steady, unrushed. Sophie looked down at her notebook, then slowly pushed it toward the center of the table. Then we should write it, she said. Daniel nodded. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to control how something ended. He picked up his pen again, but this time he did not write alone. Sophie leaned in beside him, her small hand resting near the edge of the page, not guiding, but present. "What happens next?" she asked. Daniel looked at the blank space. Then he spoke, not as a CEO, not as someone used to being right, but as someone learning. "The man," he said slowly, "realizes that what he built was never the problem." Sophie listened closely. "He just forgot who it was for," Daniel continued. She smiled slightly. "That is a good start," she said. Daniel wrote the words down, carefully, as if they mattered, because now they did. Minutes passed without either of them noticing. The coffee cooled. The hot chocolate cup sat empty. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that something quiet but meaningful was unfolding inside a small corner cafe. When Daniel finally set the pen down, the page was no longer blank. It was not perfect, but it was honest. Sophie read the final lines, her eyes moving slowly across the page. Then she looked up at him. "This ending is different," she said. Daniel nodded. "It is not finished," he replied. Sophie closed the notebook gently. "Stories like this never are," she said. There was no sadness in her voice, only understanding. Daniel glanced at his watch. It was nearly 10 o'clock. The library would be opening soon. But something told him this moment would not end here. Not really. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small card. Not a business card. Just a simple piece of paper with his personal number written clearly across it. He placed it on the table. "If you ever write another story," he said, "I would like to read it." Sophie looked at the number, then back at him. "You will listen?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze. This time there was no hesitation. "Yes," he said. Outside, the morning light stretched across the streets, brushing the city in soft gold. And somewhere between a page of words and a moment of listening, a man who once understood every language in the world finally learned the one that mattered most. Because sometimes it is not about translating words. It is about recognizing a voice and choosing to hear it.